In the early hours of January the 1st, 1959, Fulgencio Batista fled Cuba with close associates, military officials, and personal wealth. As news spread across the island, celebrations erupted almost immediately. Crowds flooded down the streets of Havana, Santiago, and countless other smaller towns. Rebel fighters entered cities to cheering civilians. Batista's government had collapsed with astonishing speed. For many Cubans, the revolution represented liberation. Years of corruption, police brutality, censorship, and political repression appeared finally over. Fidel Castro was widely viewed not as a future dictator, but as a nationalist hero, a man who had defeated tyranny against overwhelming odds. Even outside Cuba, many observers initially welcomed this revolution. Foreign journalists praised Castro's charisma and idealism. Some American commentators compared him to early revolutionary leaders who had overthrown corrupt regimes. Yet almost immediately, deeper questions emerged. What exactly would the revolution become? Would Cuba become a democracy, a socialist republic, a nationalist state independent from both the United States and the Soviet Union? Even many of Castro's own supporters remained uncertain. The answers would emerge gradually and often violently. Within only a few years, Cuba would become the center of one of the most dangerous confrontations of the Cold War. Welcome to part 2 of our series on the Cuban Revolution. If you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. We post every week and we welcome any feedback. Although Batista fled on January the 1st, Fidel Castro himself did not immediately arrive in Havana. Instead, he traveled slowly westward across Cuba in what would become a carefully staged revolutionary victory tour. Enormous crowds gathered along the route. Castro demonstrated an extraordinary ability to hold audiences for hours at a time. His speeches mixed nationalism, anti-corruption rhetoric, social reform, and revolutionary optimism. To supporters, he appeared energetic, fearless, and most of all, sincere. By January the 8th, 1959, Castro entered Havana triumphantly. The old political order has almost entirely collapsed. Batista's army rapidly disintegrated, and many former officials fled the country. Revolutionary forces now controlled Cuba. At first, Castro did not formally assume leadership of the government. A provisional administration was established, while Castro initially held command of the armed forces. Yet in practice, political authority increasingly centered around Castro himself. Within weeks, he had become a dominant figure in revolutionary Cuba. Very quickly, the revolution began reshaping the country. One of the first major actions of the revolutionary government involved trials of former Batista officials, military officers, and police. They were accused of torture, murder, and corruption. Some trials were public and widely broadcast. Others moved rapidly through revolutionary courts with limited legal protections. Hundreds of former Batista officials and security personnel were executed during the early revolutionary period. To supporters of the revolution, these executions represented justice after years of brutality. Many ordinary Cubans genuinely believed Batista's security forces deserved punishment for war, torture, and killings committed during that dictatorship. To critics, however, the trials increasingly represented political revenge. International reactions were divided. Some foreign journalists defended the executions as understandable after years of repression. Others warned that the revolutionary government was already abandoning democratic norms. Meanwhile, Castro's popularity inside Cuba remained extremely high. Promises of land reform, anti-corruption campaigns, and social equality generated enormous support, especially amongst the rural poor. But tensions with the United States were already beginning to grow. Before the revolution, land ownership in Cuba had been heavily concentrated. Large estates dominated agriculture, particularly sugar production. Some American corporations controlled enormous areas of Cuban farmland. In May 1959, Castro's government introduced the Agrarian Reform Law. Large estates were broken apart. Limits were placed on private land ownership. Some land was redistributed to peasants, while other areas became state-controlled farms. Foreign-owned property, including American assets, increasingly came under government control. For poor rural communities, these reforms were often popular. Many peasants gained land for the first time. The revolutionary government also launched literacy campaigns, expanded healthcare access, and invested in rural infrastructure. Illiteracy rates began declining significantly during the early revolutionary years. Healthcare and education became central pillars of the new Cuba. The most famous of these efforts was the 1961 Literacy Campaign, which became one of the revolution's most celebrated social achievements. Yet economic changes also created growing conflict. Wealthy Cubans, business owners, and many members of the middle and upper classes became increasingly alarmed. Thousands began leaving the country, especially for the United States. Many feared the revolution was becoming openly communist. At the same time, relationships with Washington deteriorated rapidly. Initially, the US recognized Castro's government following Batista's fall. American officials remained cautious but uncertain about Castro's long term political direction. That uncertainty soon faded. As American owned businesses and sugar interests were nationalized, tensions escalated sharply. Castro condemned what he described as decades of American economic domination over Cuba. Meanwhile, officials in Washington increasingly viewed the revolution as hostile to American interests. The Cold War intensified these fears. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the United States was deeply concerned about communist expansion globally. Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, the Communist Revolution in China, and the Korean War had already heightened anxieties in Washington. Now, a revolutionary government only 90 miles from Florida appeared potentially dangerous. Meanwhile, Fidel Castro moved steadily closer to the Soviet Union. Though historians continue debating precisely when Castro fully embraced Marxist Leninism, by 1960, Cuba's relationship with Moscow was strengthening rapidly. Soviet economic aid and oil shipments became increasingly important as US Cuban relations collapsed. In response, the United States imposed economic sanctions and began supporting covert efforts to remove Castro from power. The stage was now set for one of the Cold War's most infamous failures. In April 1961, the United States supported an invasion of Cuba carried out by Cuban exiles trained by the CIA. The plan aimed to overthrow Castro by triggering a popular uprising against the revolutionary government. Around 1,400 anti Castro exiles landed at Playa Giron in the Bay of Pigs along Cuba's southern coast. The operation quickly became a disaster. Poor planning, weak intelligence, and a lack of local support undermined the invasion almost immediately. Castro's forces responded rapidly and crushed the attackers within a few days. Many invaders were killed or captured. The failed invasion dramatically strengthened Castro politically. Inside Cuba, many citizens now viewed the revolution as defending national sovereignty against foreign aggression. Castro used the invasion to justify tighter internal control and further militarization of Cuban society. Most importantly, the Bay of Pigs pushed Cuba even closer to the Soviet Union. Shortly before the invasion, Castro publicly declared the revolution socialist. New Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev increasingly viewed Cuba as a crucial Cold War ally in the Western Hemisphere. That alliance would soon bring the world to the edge of a nuclear war. In 1962, the Soviet Union secretly began placing nuclear missiles in Cuba. For Khrushchev, the decision served several purposes. It strengthened Soviet strategic power, protected Cuba from another possible American invasion, and challenged US dominance in the region. American reconnaissance flights soon discovered the missile sites. What followed became one of the most dangerous moments in human history. In October 1962, US President John F. Kennedy announced a naval blockade, officially termed a quarantine, around Cuba to prevent additional Soviet military shipments from arriving. For 13 days, the world stood on the brink of a nuclear conflict. America and Soviet military forces prepared for possible war. Nuclear weapons were readied. International tension reached extraordinary levels. Inside Cuba, many civilians feared invasion or annihilation. Castro himself expected a possible American attack. Eventually, negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev produced a compromise. The Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States secretly agreed to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey and publicly promised not to invade Cuba. The crisis ended peacefully, but Cuba remained isolated from the United States and deeply tied to the Soviet Union. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Castro steadily consolidated political power. Opposition parties disappeared. Independent newspapers were shut down or brought under state control. Political dissent became increasingly dangerous. Thousands of Cubans were imprisoned for political reasons during the revolutionary period, while many others fled into exile. Large Cuban exile communities formed, particularly in Miami. At the same time, the revolutionary government continued major social programs. Healthcare expanded dramatically across the island. Cuba developed one of the most extensive public healthcare systems in Latin America. Education campaigns significantly reduced illiteracy, university access expanded, rural medical services reached previously neglected regions. These achievements became central to Cuba's international image. Supporters of Castro argued that the revolution improved life for ordinary Cubans through education, healthcare, and social equality. Critics argued that these gains came at the cost of political freedom, economic stagnation, censorship, and one party rule. Both interpretations contained elements of truth. Economically, Cuba remained heavily dependent on sugar exports and Soviet financial support. Centralized planning produced mixed results. Some industries improved while others stagnated. Consumer shortages became increasingly common over time. Yet Castro himself remained remarkably durable, politically anyway. Assassination plots, sabotage campaigns, and decades of hostility from the US failed to remove him from power. The Cuban Revolution influenced politics far beyond the island itself. Castro and Che Guevara hoped Cuba would inspire revolutionary movements across Latin America, Africa, and beyond. Cuban military advisors and troops later became involved in Cold War conflicts in Angola, Ethiopia, and elsewhere. Che Guevara left Cuba in the mid 1960s, hoping to spread revolution internationally. He was eventually captured and executed in Bolivia in 1967. Over time, Che himself became an international symbol of revolutionary idealism, though interpretations of him remain deeply divided. Meanwhile, Cuba's relationship with the Soviet Union strengthened further throughout the 1970s and the 1980s. Soviet subsidies became essential to the Cuban economy. In many ways, Cuba survived economically because of Soviet support. Then, suddenly, that support disappeared. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. For Cuba, the consequences were devastating. Trade collapsed almost overnight, fuel shortages became severe, food supplies declined dramatically, public transportation nearly broke down. The Cuban government referred to this period as the special period. Living standards deteriorated sharply during the 1990s, yet despite enormous hardship, Castro's government survived. Limited economic reforms were introduced, tourism expanded once again, some private businesses were cautiously permitted in certain areas, but the political system itself remained tightly controlled. Even after the Cold War ended, Cuba remained politically isolated from the United States for decades. Fidel Castro remained Cuba's dominant political figure for nearly half a century. In July 2006, due to a serious illness, he temporarily transferred power to his brother Raul Castro. In 2008, Fidel formally stepped down as president. By this stage, Castro had become one of the most recognizable political figures in modern history. To supporters, he was the man who resisted American dominance, expanded healthcare and education, and defended Cuban sovereignty. To critics, he was an authoritarian ruler who imprisoned opponents, suppressed dissent, and denied political freedoms to millions. Fidel Castro died on November 25, 2016, at the age of 90, yet the arguments surrounding his legacy never truly ended. The Cuban Revolution remains one of the most consequential events of the 20th century. It transformed Cuba politically, socially, economically, and culturally. It reshaped Cold War politics. It created one of the longest running conflicts between neighboring states in modern history. It inspired revolutionaries across the world while alarming governments throughout the West. Even today, Cuba remains marked by the events of 1959. The revolution promised equality, independence, and national dignity, and in some areas, particularly healthcare and education, it achieved significant successes. In others, political repression and economic hardship became defining realities of revolutionary rule. And perhaps that is why the Cuban Revolution still provokes such fierce debate, because it was never simply a story of heroes or villains. It was a revolution born from genuine inequality and corruption, then ultimately created its own system of power, loyalty, control, and myth. And more than half a century later, the world is still arguing